Air quality matters, inside our buildings and out. I believe we already have many of the tools we need to deliver better outcomes for many. The conversations we have and how we share this knowledge is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and this is episode 30 of the Air Quality Matters podcast. Coming up, a conversation with Sotirios Papathanasiou. I've been following Sitirious for years, and his blog, See the Air, is really a must follow. He is an electrical engineer by trade, but it's safe to say he has been one of the leading voices in the air quality community in Europe and the States for several years. He recently worked for a very well-known PM sensor manufacturer and is now off on ventures new. We discussed how the view of air quality has changed since he started writing and what he sees in its trajectory next. We discussed this middle tier of sensor technology that sits above low-cost sensors and what value they bring, and much more. Thanks for listening as always. Do check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Sotirios Papathanasiou.
When we talk about air quality and PM 2.2 values in general, we generally try to describe how good or bad the air quality is, right? But with mass concentration values, unfortunately, we lose information about the smaller sizes of particulates. Even though if your sensor technology supports and can measure those particles, by converting now those numbers into mass, you have zero visibility of how extent the problem was.
Okay, interesting.
So basically what I propose and other experts out there is that we have to look at the number of particles for the different sizes that we can measure with the available technology. And of course, if we have technology that they can go to the ultrafine spectrum, even better. But even, concentrations of particulates, let's say that we have like 1,000 particles at 0.3 micron in diameter. Once you convert that number into mass, you're going to get something 0.0 something, very small. It doesn't give you any understanding, right? But if you have a particle of 2.5 microns in diameter and then you convert it to PM, to mass concentration values, then you will get a very high number. And that's like a false alarming. Why is the bigger sizes of particles translated, let's say, well enough in order to understand the impact they have on human health, and why the smaller particles they can, penetrate deeper inside us, don't get so much attention when we convert them into the mass spectrum.
You're a fellow communicator around air quality, and I've been following you for years now, it seems, particularly through your blog, See the Air. How have you seen public awareness change in that time, both public, but also the business of air quality awareness change in that period of time?
Right. When I first started, there wasn't much of awareness out there. I don't want to say that I created the awareness out there, but indeed, from the, everyday people, you will see that they had very little knowledge on the matter. I will remember like when I was on a younger age at school and teachers will try to explain us about air pollution. And they will only focus, I'm coming from Greece, so they will only focus on the effects that air pollution has on the marbles of the ancient marbles, because they create, acid rain and they will destroy the marble eventually. But they will never talk about the impact air pollution has on human health, right? So a few years later, I got into the university. Electronic engineering has nothing to do with environmental, but around 2010, I realized that, something has to happen in the environmental sector and how we perceive air pollution. And sensors is the best way to understand air pollution, because in most cases we cannot quantify how bad the air quality is based on our senses. So at this journey on, merging those two things, I decided at the same time that it's time to educate people somehow on the matter. And very, very little happened back then, but I insisted because I really liked the matter, so why not? So then something happened around 2016, I will say. uh, the technology became more accessible with low cost sensors. So people started to investing, time and effort in understanding more air quality by purchasing low cost air quality sensors or monitors. And then I gained more traction. Then COVID hit, and it was an explosion, right? Like, you will hear about air quality everywhere. It was directly correlated with, aerosol transmission pathogens. And from then to now, I see an explosion in the business wide, not only for me, but many people got interested, right? And they wanted to explore better air quality, especially indoor. However, lately, like the last 2 years, a year ago, I have also noticed a decline in the technology that it is available out there, right? Like, for example, many companies wanted to jump into the air quality industry. They will invest lots of money, but at the end of the day, they will create the same sensor but in a different enclosure. So eventually, with this recipe in mind, you fail. You won't succeed. But the scientific community is still holding very strong. They still keep pushing the governments into doing the right thing towards indoor air quality and how important is ventilation. And that's the good side of the story.
Yeah, so it's a very good point, actually. There's definitely two tracks. The academic track is very strong, and
Yes.
I don't think I've ever seen more research and publications on air quality across the spectrum of disciplines than I've seen today. Um, you brought back amazing memories, actually, when you said that, Sotirios, about acid rain. I mean, that's probably my memory, and most of us of my generation's memory of air quality was, particularly if you lived in historic parts of the world,
Yeah.
the impact acid rain was having on historic buildings was a real thing in the 80s.
Mhm.
I certainly remember that. Um, so it's actually it's really funny that you mentioned that. I'd never thought of that. I must actually try and get somebody on from the, I don't know, the acid rain community. Is it still a thing? Have we changed?
I
Do you
mean,
know? Have we changed something in pollution from cars that stops acid rain now or something? Because we used
the
to talk
chemistry,
about
yes,
nothing but it.
yes, the chemistry is a bit different right now when it comes to the pollutants out there. Sulfuric acid or gases create the acid rain in most cases. So yes, there is some change there, but there was also a change in the attention. Like, people are more important than marbles in ancient Greece. So let's focus on the effects of air pollution on people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose the only thing that trumped acid rain at one point was ozone depletion. Was another thing we
Right.
saw.
Mhm.
You know, so when you look back historically, actually, we've got some very good examples of understanding the impacts of air pollution, both on environmental health and on personal health, from smoking to acid rain to impacts on the upper atmosphere. We've got quite a good history of getting it into public awareness. Maybe we'll look back at the COVID period and it will be a similar blip where there was a massive interest in a particular this one being bioaerosols and infectious aerosols in the air around us. Makes you wonder what will be the next big air quality thing to think about. Perhaps it's particulate matter, to be fair. I think the awareness is
Yes.
growing increasingly on that.
Yes, and if you've seen, like, this year alone, we had EPA from the US lowering the standards, like what they consider a safe limit of PM 2.5. Then Europe came along, and recently also Taiwan came along by lowering the upper limits of PM 2.5. So I see some trajectory there on trying to decrease the PM values for the ambient air quality.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the National Academies came out with a report recently on indoor particulate matter. And I think that's starting to ratchet up the awareness of the impact on the indoor environment as well. So it certainly seems to be something that's certainly got a lot of evidence behind it, even if it is general ambient environmental PM. We do seem to have a lot of evidence of the impacts on health. So aside from that academic track, you also get the sense that there's been a shift at the other end of the scale, at the business production of low cost sensor end of the market post pandemic, that there was a lot of products hit the market. It was the world to start with of some fairly specialist producers of that type of technology, but we're seeing more and more Asian manufacturers coming into play now, low cost electronics, that kind of race to the bottom sector, where there's as much on the Amazon type sites as there are from the specialist producers. It's quite a heady mix out there now of low cost sensors, isn't it, in one way or another?
Yeah, many players, but if you open the devices, I really like opening devices because of my electronic background. You will see at the end of the day that they have the same technology. A low cost sensor that it's worth around $15, let's say, US dollars. And it's limited on what it can do and measure, and how you can use the data as well. Like in some cases, I will say, okay, you want to build a device with these low cost sensors, but then you have to realize that you have to build around this product a way to inform the people in a more curative way. Like people don't understand what's 10 micrograms per cubic meter, right? So you have to give them a better context on how and when they have to improve air quality. And especially nowadays with AI, machine learning, and all of these technologies, it's very easy actually to do this kind of work and inform people better on air quality. Like, for example, if you have a sensor and you cook in your house, you will see that during the cooking process, you raise the PM values inside your house. That's normal, especially if you're frying food, tons of particles. So by using, let's say, a machine learning model, it's easy to say to the device and to the user eventually, hey, before you go to cook today, make sure you have, the fan open, use some lids. So you work in a proactive way in order to avoid this pollution be created in an indoor environment. So this is, for example, a simple example. And then you mentioned something about those companies out there like Amazon. Yeah, they just wanted to play along and see if they're going to get any traction and earn some bucks. And that's all that they care. So that's the reason it's very important to investigate before purchasing products, see if the company is going to be around, next year. Because if the company is not available next year, this product won't work either, especially IoT products. They rely on a cloud platform, and without this platform around, they are useless.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a really important point there about this communicating risk to people, that at the end of the day, we're not going to stop people from cooking, nor would we want them to. In fact,
Right.
we want to encourage people to cook, right? Otherwise, we'd be encouraging a takeaway society, which does nobody any favors apart from the Deliveroos of the world. But the challenge therein is where we seem to come up against the wall, and I wonder where the solution for that comes from, in what we can lean on and learn to leverage how to communicate this risk better to people, because it's not it's a tolerable risk to a lot of people
Mhm.
cooking. The smell of food in the house is not unpleasant sometimes, and it's indicative of, smells are very evocative of growing up, and that your favorite smells of cooking all can be quite nice, so people will see the risk in a different way. So we have to find ways of both translating that risk in the moment to say to people, there are some actions that you can take to eliminate that. But also, we need to get better, I think, at communicating the chronic risk of some of these pollutants, that we find a way of getting people to understand that while we're not saying don't do something, you've got to understand the compound effect of being exposed to some of these pollutants over the longer term. And I think a lot of that comes from storytelling and framing and changing habits over time and general education. There's a lot to be done there.
Mhm. You are absolutely right. That's the number one pain point of air pollution. Um, in most cases, there are some exceptions. The effects are in the long term, so people are not very smart, I would say, into getting analyzing or understanding the patterns that they are created in order to deteriorate their health, right? So you may notice effects of air pollution by living many years in a very polluted area. And unfortunately, your brain does not correlate that this illness may be a result of your exposure to the air pollution. And yeah, it's tough to convince people on that subject. I've tried myself, uh, especially when people, let's go back again to cooking. People that they really like barbecues and stuff like that, right? And they stand on top of the fire or the burning of the coal, and they inhale every single particle that comes out of this pit of a fire. Are there then alternatives? I won't disagree that the food is very flavor. I'm not gonna fall into that direction, but you also have to realize that are you exposing yourself to those pollutions, and is it worth the effort at the end of the day, or are there any other alternatives that you can cook the same meal, that and they won't create any problems to you in the long term?
Yeah.
That's something very common.
Yeah. It's a
And another
really
super
difficult
common
one.
problem, yeah, another super common problem is, I'm sure you know that very well, especially in the UK, wood fires, right? For heating purposes, wood stoves, and all of those devices that they use out there to heat their houses by burning biomass, right? Unfortunately, we were sold like it's gonna be a sustainable way, but it's not. Of course, this is not a sustainable way to live or heat your house. And when you heat your house by burning wood, you not only deteriorate the air quality inside your house, there are plenty of studies that support that idea, but you also pollute everyone around you, right? And you create a harsh environment for some people that especially have difficulties or more needs for better air quality than other people.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I'm part of the Safer Air project. It's an Australian non-profit organization that wants to bring awareness on the fact that there are people with disabilities in the breathing, so they require better quality than other people, and people with disabilities, breathing disabilities, they need access to good air quality in indoor places and other places as well, and no one looks uh, after them. People with asthma, people with cancer, COPD, etc. They all suffer, and they have more strict requirements when it comes to air quality. And unfortunately, when you burn wood, you don't uh, you don't take into account their lives, and you make their lives even more miserable.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I can't remember. I think it was a conversation I had with Yella Laverge. He was talking about a consideration in Belgium about the legalities of allowing people to smoke in their own homes, and we were talking about
Hmm.
the difficulty in crossing a threshold legally of saying what people can and can't do from a risk perspective in their own homes. And he was saying the position in Belgium was rather that you have an obligation as a parent not to put ill health on your children. You know, that there are some things that there's a public good, nature to air quality. We
Yeah.
all share the air. Um, and as much of an exclusive as it is that Sotirios on this podcast would like to ban barbecuing and wood burning in stoves and immediately turn off half of North America and the UK and Ireland, that's the challenge we have, isn't it? Is that
Right.
there are
Yeah.
there are things that are objectively harmful at a
Hmm.
population level. It's very difficult to say to somebody that having a barbecue and standing over it for an afternoon with all your friends and having fun is going to do you a defined amount of harm. Um, but that's kind of where we need to get to, I guess, in the same way that we used to have this metric for smoking that every cigarette costs you 7 seconds of your life, that we need to start quantifying the harm that this stuff does in a way that resonates with people so they can say, okay, I recognize barbecuing is going to accumulatively do me harm over my lifetime. Is this
Hmm.
something I should change my habits or behavior around to minimize that risk? In the same way that if I have a stove, is that a decision I'd make a second time around in my lifetime to put another stove in? It's a really interesting one. Do you get much feedback from your blogs and things when you're communicating on air quality? Do you get
Yeah.
that kind of engagement from community with the things that you
Yeah.
say and what resonates and what doesn't?
Absolutely. People reach me through social media, through my blog, by sending out an email. Uh, you bet. Like, they're there. They're waiting. I've see also, when you track the traffic on your blog, you see exactly where they're landing, what they're looking for, um, and you can understand better what they're trying to do with the information that you share. And yeah, absolutely. And I think something else that I wanted to talk about what you said earlier, like restricting people from smoking indoors. Like, that's not the same for all the countries, though. Like here in the US, for example, because of the rights people have inside their houses, no one is allowed to tell them what they're supposed to do indoors. So they can smoke or cook or whatever they want. Uh, and it's very difficult for the government to put a stop on that. But you don't want to force something like that to people. You want to educate them, right? Like throughout their lives, by advertising or any other means that is possible, that this is the right thing to do for you, for your kids, and also for the community that you're living, right? Because humans cannot survive on their own. We need the community of people. And it's very important to be very respectful of the communities around us.
Particularly in different cultures, we've seen how that line has been crossed, particularly in North America, around your obligation to the community when it came to infectious diseases. It
Mhm.
really divided a nation on what you should be obliged to do and how serious something may or may not be. It's a very difficult line to tread, and you can see if you go too far, some people within the spectrum of the community will rail against that kind of restriction or enforcement. And yet in other cultures, people align with that kind of thing much more quickly. I grew up through the smoking bans of both Ireland and the UK. Um,
Mhm.
And you look back on it now, and it was as if it was nothing, absolutely nothing. People
Yeah.
complained, and then when it was in place, everybody went, "Yeah, fair enough." You know, it makes a lot of sense, I suppose, and people just got on with
People
it.
hate scenes in general.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting
In
one.
many things, not only air quality. Like they don't like chains. They're afraid of the chains. They think it's something that's gonna make their lives more difficult. But instead, we are trying to do something better for the world, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And practically, when we're talking about, and I talk about this a lot, particularly when we're talking about air quality in the built environment, there are only so many things we can do in the built environment to minimize that risk anyway. So there's a whole body of work trying to understand the complexities of air quality, and there's a lot, and their impact on our health. But ultimately, when it comes down to the control of those risks in a space, we're fairly limited to a handful of things that we can do. So as long as we understand well what they are, we can do a pretty good job of eliminating most of the risks that we come across. You know, just good ventilation and decent local exhaust ventilation. You know, cooking pollution from hoods, or sorry, cooking pollution from cooking would be far less of a problem if cooker hoods were any good, you know, and used. But that's half the problem in our part of the world anyway. The risks that we see from cooking pollution is pollutants hanging around in the space because they're not exhausted well enough. I appreciate in parts of the southern parts of the globe, a lot of that is down to your exposure with the type of fuels that you use to cook with and your direct exposure to those particulates. But particularly in this part of the world, most of the risk is down to the fact we just don't exhaust pollutants very effectively in the home.
Right.
And a change in understanding and habit around that could have a massive impact at a public health level.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what's the situation in the UK, but here in the US, for example, we have a huge problem with exhaust of fumes from the cooking process because most houses here are equipped with microwave rangers, hoods, or whatever you want to call them. Their name changes all the time. So basically, what it is, it's like a microwave on top of your stove, and it just takes the air, passes it through an aluminium mesh with hole of that size, and then spill all the air on the ceiling inside the house in the same location. So basically, you spend electricity to operate this device, and in order to recirculate the air through a mesh hole aluminium filter, and people think that that works, right? They don't have the understanding that this is useless and misinformation, misleading, and should be banned. But no, it's there in all the houses, and there is nothing I can do.
Yeah, it's a horror show, to be honest, from as far as I can see in most jurisdictions I look at. You know, we have the same here, those very cheap recirculating hoods. The decisions on cooker hoods generally are aesthetic. Is it wood for my country kitchen or metal for my modern kitchen? It's an aesthetic choice. Or if it's
Hmm.
being installed by a developer, what's the cheapest possible piece of crap that I can put in? Because nobody's going to spend any more on this apartment or house based on the type of range hood that I put in. So why would I spend any money on it at all? And we see very little guidance on regulation other than the flow rates that those devices achieve. So is it any wonder? Yet, ironically, it could be one of the biggest public health measures we could put into place in homes is decent cooker hoods. But you very
Right.
rarely see a specification on one. I don't. There are a few high-end German kind of Bosch Miele type products that are advertised as quiet and demand controlled and will come on when you start cooking and things like that. So it's a start. I think it's there are some solutions out there. But we need, as you say, we need to be far more robust on that direct exhaust to atmosphere of particulate matter from the home. And it's not hard, to be fair. Most cookers are on external walls or have reasonable access to an external wall. It's not hard to duct a cooker hood to outside and exhaust it. It's just people don't care.
Yeah, there is no framework in order to guide them what they supposed to do and build for the people that are gonna spend their life and cook and eat inside this particular apartment, right? In my case, for example, I struggle with this house as well. I'm lucky enough because next to my kitchen there is the bathroom with a real exhaust. So I will have to turn on the exhaust from the bathroom in order to mitigate some of the pollutants that I create during the cooking processes through the bathroom outside. But again, I have also adapted the means that I cook and what I cook. I will never fry anything. Never. It's like if I fry here, it's unlivable. It's tremendous. I will have to cook in the oven or by boiling stuff, safe ways, not to create, tremendous amount of pollution indoors.
It is frightening, isn't it? The moment you start measuring, particularly particulate matter and some of the chemicals that are produced when you cook, it is amazing how big an impact frying has. And it's the numbers do not lie. It's horrific.
Mm-hmm.
Yet evocatively, that's the smell of bacon wafting up the stairs in the morning, or the lovely smells coming from the kitchen is actually what it is a load of pollution coming from the kitchen. And I think what people struggle to join the dots on is that those cooking smells aren't healthy to inhale necessarily, particularly when they're attached to microfine particles that we were never designed to breathe those in and absorb them straight into our bloodstream. So what might be safe enough to eat or come into contact with on your skin is not necessarily safe to be breathing into the deep parts of your lungs, right?
Right. Exactly. And it's okay if you do it once, no harm there, but we talk about every day, you eat every day, right? And if you start doing that constantly, then it accumulates over time.
And I think that translates to the DALYs that we see, the disability adjusted life years per 100,000 of the population of particulate matter. These frequent exposures to particulate matters is what drives the harm. You could argue, particularly here, if you live in Ireland, we might have 3 or 4 barbecues a year because realistically the weather isn't suitable for it. So am I going to get too concerned about 2 or 3 exposures of high levels of particulates once or twice a year? Probably not. But if I live on the Mediterranean or in sunnier parts of the world and it's a daily part of our cuisine and cooking is putting things on the barbecue, particularly solid fuel barbecues, there's a frequency to that risk all of a sudden.
I used to live in Spain, and especially in the region of Malaga, lots of people know from. They have like a tradition there and like a tourist attraction as well. That they cook fish on an open fire, and you sit like next to it, and supposedly you enjoy food and the environment, but all of those fumes, they come to you, and it's okay if you do it once, but if you do it like for living, like people there, they really do that every day, right? Like cooks and the employees that they work on those restaurants, they do expose themselves in lots of particulates.
Yeah. I wonder if there's anything to learn as we see what the impacts of monitoring things like CO2 more and more, that people get used to those kind of numbers. You're seeing a general awareness in the population now for knowing that there's something important about 1,000 parts per million. They don't really understand why, but they understand that bigger numbers are a problem, and we like to keep things below 1,000 parts per million generally. It's quite amazing when you talk to people, particularly if they're exposed to school environments or education environments or office environments where these things are
Hmm.
starting to be monitored. You're seeing that recognition appear, still at low levels. I mean, I'm not saying, if you speak to my mother-in-law that she'll have a clue what parts per million of CO2 is, but like, particularly in the younger generation, you're starting to see it more and more. And I wonder if we'll learn some things from that general population exposure to those kind of numbers that we can translate more effectively downstream to some of these specific pollutants of interest, so that people start to instinctively know that PM 2.5 above 15 starts to be problematic, and if I see something at 60, I know that something's got to change, or, whatever it ends up being.
Yeah. Uh, CO2 is a bit different than PM 2.5. Some communities were created out of COVID, and they really try to educate others as well by measuring the air quality wherever they go from a CO2 standpoint. So you will see them everywhere having a small device that measures carbon dioxide, and they will try to keep themselves as safe as possible from airborne diseases, right? Especially inside closed spaces, airplanes, libraries, or bars. I find it very challenging sometimes because eventually, even in a flight, let's say you are on a plane and you wear a mask, you have to drink water, you have to eat something. So you will take off the mask eventually, right? So if there is a host of a pathogen inside the plane, I think it's very difficult to protect yourself based only by wearing a mask and keep track of the CO2. And that's the reason in most cases airplanes have very good filters. So you will see very low PM values because they're trying to trap every particle possible. And unfortunately, in a very high altitude, air is not so easy to get from outside. So that's the reason you will see higher levels of CO2. But that doesn't mean that the air is not safe inside the airplane.
Yeah, and what you speak to there is context, and it's very hard to translate threshold or basic numbers into context for people that they can use
Mm-hmm.
meaningfully. And we see this with CO2 all the time, people misunderstanding it as a proxy for
Right.
risk.
Mm-hmm.
But then, we also have to get over ourselves a little bit, I think, about the imperfectness of field measurement. Anybody that does field measurements of particularly air quality knows how difficult it is to get accurate, meaningful measurements, even if you know what you're doing. And sometimes it's just about translating risk and building awareness, even if somebody is stood in an environment where it's just them in a small room and the CO2 is going up, and they're then panicking that the air quality is bad, and they don't really understand what that risk really translates from and to. At least somebody's thinking about it, and it can
Mm-hmm.
help. It's an intro. I know what you mean. It's a frustrating thing to watch sometimes when you see people misinterpret air quality. I think we have to use that and turn it around and understand how we can frame it and create action that helps. Because if we're seeing that with something as simple as CO2, it's going to get really hard when we get down to things like formaldehydes and ozones and particulate matters and so on. Talking to somebody about ozone the other day, about measuring ozone, and one of the common misconceptions is that if we see low ozone in a space, that somehow that's a good thing. But actually what could have happened is all that ozone could have turned into other pollutants. So the low reading is actually an indication that some chemistry has gone on and it's turned into other stuff. So just because you're not measuring ozone doesn't mean ozone hasn't had a really nasty impact in the space. So we've got,
Mm-hmm.
we've got quite a long way to go, I think, when it comes to how we communicate this in a way that somebody can take something and do something positive with it to get a better outcome.
Yes, air quality is quite complex and the chemistry behind it as well, right? Like pollutants, they will change form over time. If there is sunlight or if there is not sunlight, many factors they're going to influence what eventually you consider air quality. And you cannot say that only by measuring CO2 or only measuring particulates you have good or bad air quality. It's a parameter, yes, but it's not the whole picture of what's going on. So when you dive now deep into the ozone that you mentioned, or formaldehyde, or any other, gas, then it becomes even more complicated, and you then need more tools, more instruments to measure accurately the conditions inside the room or outside, even.
Yeah. Uh, but also, I mean, I suppose on the positive side, and you must have seen this in the years that you've been looking at it, particularly somebody with an interest in electronics, how fast this sector is moving forward at the moment. Stuff that we just didn't think was possible even 5 years ago is starting
Mm-hmm.
to appear on our horizon as a possibility of measuring and monitoring and translating information. I mean, you and I are from a time where indoor air quality monitoring was really done with data loggers and academic equipment and was incredibly expensive to do. And we've seen literally in the last few years the evolution of that low cost sensor technology really come on. And yes, there's all sorts of limitations around it. But compared to where we were even 5 years ago, it's astonishing what we can fit in a little white box now.
Yeah, and we do have the low cost sensors, but we also have, lower cost sensors, which are like the middle ground of technology that allows academics, if you want, researchers to get their hands into monitoring solutions, but without spending like uh, 20 grand or 30 grand in just buying one equipment. Um, like, for example, you will see technologies that they comply to standards and they are used also by industrial hygienists or other professionals that they need a better grade of instrument that, can report back to something, and it's not going, no one is going to question the accuracy, which is very important. Especially with low cost sensors, you can question how accurate they are. But now, when we talk about the middle range of products of sensor technology, those sensors are, yeah, they are more expensive, but because they go through a process of validation, right? And this is very important as well.
That's a really good point, actually. It's something we've not touched on much on this podcast, is that layer above low cost sensors that
Mhm.
is generally in the hands of professionals, I would say, and academics that
Yeah.
understand not only their capabilities but their limitations well, so can apply something that has a much tighter reference on accuracy than the low cost sensors, but has gone through a process and is being used typically in a process that means you can stand over much more the kind of results you're getting. Um, where is that kind of technology at the moment? What are the kinds of things that it's starting to be able to do well, that kind of middle tier of monitoring? Particulate matter is one of them, I guess. It's starting to break apart particulate matter in a much more defined way than what we would see typically in a low cost optical reader that's making a guess roughly at a reference point of around 2.5 micrograms and making some calculated assumptions on what's above it and
Mhm.
below it. These things are doing something differently, I guess.
They actually do the same thing, but there is a but there. So we have two type of technologies, right? We have a photometer or an FLometer, if you like, and then we have an optical particle counter. Now, an FLometer, it's gonna do what exactly you've mentioned. It sees a cloud of particles, and then based on algorithms and assumptions, it calculates a mass. Those numbers can be very forgiving, right? Especially for the smaller particles. Uh, like I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, like when you have zero point 0.3 microns and you convert them into mass, it doesn't matter if you are wrong by 1,000 of them or 2,000, 10,000 of them. It doesn't matter because they are so small. Their conversion into mass won't affect a lot the final number that you will get. So that's the main problem with those sensors, with nephelometers. They see a cloud of particles, they make lots of assumptions, and they are targeting in one specific PM value, in most cases PM 2.5. In a recent conference that I was, they were talking about why they're not able to see PM10. They're not able to give you good values on PM10 for a various of reasons. I don't know if you're interested to going that route. And then the other technology is the optical particle counters, which this technology, they use again the light scattering method, but now they have better, let's say, chambers, better airflow, steady airflow, which is very important as well, a better laser. And then what they try to do is that they try to count every individual particle, it doesn't matter of the size, count it and size it and classify it in different bins. And they do that by complying to standards. There are some standards out there from ISO and a GIS standard from Japan that they give instructions on the manufacturers on how they have to produce this product and what they're supposed to measure and what are the tolerances of error. Something you don't see with the low cost sensors, but you do see them with those lower or middle rates sensors. And now by having, the exact number of particles in the different sizes, 0.3, 0.5, 1 micron, 2.5, 5, and 10, then you are able to calculate the mass if this is the way you want to use the data, and an even more precise way as well.
And
And
does that standard then mean that if I get effectively 2 or 3 different products from 2 or 3 different manufacturers, if they're following that standard, I should get broadly similar results from the same environment?
Yes. According to the standard, they're supposed to be plus minus 20%. But I can tell you from certainty, because I've been working with one of those companies, that if you put like different batches of the same sensor, you will see that they are dead right each time. And that happens because those products are also calibratable. You can calibrate them by comparing exactly what you're getting from this instrument to a standard, something that you cannot do with the lower cost sensors. In most cases, they will take a room, they will fill it with a bunch of sensors inside there. They will put only one reference, and they will expect all of those sensors to have the same value, something which is not possible from physics standpoint, but they consider that good enough to do it, and then they release the product into the market, right?
Yeah. So what's the use case for that type of technology? We see low cost sensors. Let's just stick on particulate matter for the moment, that are getting deployed at a low cost across wide areas, longitudinal in nature. So they're going and being deployed over time to give patterns. And I often describe them as the health wearables of the indoor environment. They're useful. They show patterns and some things that are going on. But like health wearables, at some point you should probably go to your GP and get a blood test and see what's actually going on with you. And similarly with low cost sensors, they'll give you an idea if there's some patterns within the building, but they won't necessarily tell you the nature of it. Where do these types of sensors start to come into the market? They're the tools of the occupational hygienist and the occupational health and safety person that's coming in and trying to troubleshoot, is it? Or enable companies to meet a certain certification in a pharmaceutical setting? I take it it's that kind of a level?
Yes, exactly. You're right. So you have the industrial hygienist, for example, that they have to have some kind of a certainty when they report data back. But then you also have the clean room industry. It doesn't matter if it is a pharmaceutical or even if it is a hospital that has to, verify that the operation room is free from particulates, which, by the way, they're directly correlated with outcomes from the surgery. And then you have the academics, which they want a higher grade instrument to do some kind of research of their own. Like, for example, I was talking the other day with a researcher from the Oklahoma University. He's using those kind of instruments to measure exactly how, the toilets disperse water aerosols into the environment. So he will place like many of them inside the room, and he will create patterns of how the particles flow inside the room and how far they can reach and infect people with, pathogens that may are present in the business that we do in
Yeah, nice.
toilets.
There's no nice way of framing what you're describing there. So I think
Yeah.
everybody can leave that one to their imagination. Yeah, indeed.
But it's very important, this
Yeah,
kind of research, right?
for
Because
sure.
then once they understand the patterns that they created with the aerosols inside toilets, they can come with solutions and create products or better way to flush a toilet that is going to mitigate that issue.
Have you seen that sector expanding at a similar trajectory to the low cost sector? Was there a boom during COVID period that's tailed off now?
Mm.
Has it been more consistent? What does that sector look like compared to what most of the listeners would be familiar with, which is the low cost sensor market?
You mean from the academic standpoint?
Well, from general, for like if you're a manufacturer now of that type of technology in the space, is it a market that is steadily growing, that boomed out of nowhere during COVID and then died a death? How's it kind of looking as a market, that middle ground sensor
Um,
market?
I don't think COVID affected that kind of market a lot. It was growing steadily over the years either way. First of all, because they have to comply with some kind of standards. So they have to measure air quality either way. And then if you want, to build a good product, you have to measure the air quality as well because it directly affects the yield. Let's say if we go to the semiconductor industry, you know that if the air is contaminated inside those fabs, those particles can deposit on the wafers and they will lead to lower yield. And it's not only about microchips. This applies everywhere, like even in the beverage and food industry. If the air is contaminated and those particles, they can be, harmless or they can be with pathogens, full of pathogens. If they land on the beverage or the food, they will spoil them faster. So you need to keep those environments cleaner in order to achieve better results for your business.
Mm. And is it is it a sector that we can learn something from when it comes to how we understand pollution risk and communicate it, because there's so much
Yes.
more detail? Because
Yes.
our frame of reference for communication on indoor air quality typically is being driven, I think it's fair to say, from the low cost sensor end of things. The
Mhm.
what we can do with a heat map and a ziggy zaggy line on a screen and an alert in an email is kind of driven from that, let's say, kind of reset kind of level perspective. Is there something we can learn from that middle ground on how to better communicate some of this risk? Because you were talking about, for example, the particulate difference between mass and numbers of particulates in a
Right.
space. I guess there's so much more we can glean from that type of information.
hmm Yes, and you were right. Like, I think we have already applying some things from the clean room or contamination space into the air quality, normal air quality, and you will see that by exploring all the green building certificates that they are available nowadays, right? So now you have to comply to some kind of a standard, which they are not, but if you want to achieve some certainty of recognition that your building is safe enough, you have to measure the air quality and do some other things as well. Um, but that comes actually from the contamination space, where they have to test the space, validate that there is no pollution, and do that frequently, not by only once and call it a day, but like by having once a month. I don't know how often do they do it, but eventually monitor air quality in a continuous way in order to understand better the air quality and report back, inform the public as well at the same time that, hey, I have air quality monitors in my buildings, and this is the air quality right now. We have seen those big screens in big buildings. I don't know how common are they in the UK, but here in the US, when you go, for example, on a conference, you will always see that they are trying their best to deliver better air quality for the occupants. And it's the same logic, right? You have to comply to some kind of a standard.
Yeah, and we're seeing increasingly regulations starting to describe a minimum entry point for particularly
Mhm.
public
Yeah.
spaces, that there's at least some monitoring going on. And what you're describing there, I guess, is that balance between the frequency of detailed air quality assessments and the lower cost longitudinal kind of public facing data that we see on the screens, that we see the likes of Well had introduced in V2, where there's the longitudinal element, the permanent monitoring, and an annual, I think it is, inspections for a range of pollutants.
Hmm.
um, I'm guessing the pharmaceutical spaces and the medical spaces have been operating in that way for a long time, that they've had to find what the right balance is between the frequency of detailed measurements and the proliferation of lower cost monitoring in those spaces. So it's how we see that translate down to the rest of the built environment, because at the moment most of it is just the minimum entry point. How many CO2 sensors are you going to stick in a public building, and do you have to display one of them on a screen somewhere to say that it's below 1,000 parts per million? That's kind of where we've got to with the stick. The carrot at the other end, at the kind of the well end of things, where they're saying, okay, there's a methodology, we'd like you to do this and do this at least once a year and report and upload those results. But there's a big gap between those two in the built
Right.
environment, isn't there?
Yes. And, first of all, I would like to say that air quality is something dynamic. It changes over time. It's not going to be the same today and tomorrow. Um, it's not going to be the same now and in an hour. You never know why it's going to change. Maybe because, I don't know, a wildfire happened and, wind blow all of those particles into your building. So I do believe in continuous monitoring. However, I do understand at the same time that there are some limitations on the budgetary side, like how much money can you spend, or can you afford having all of those monitors in your building that they're going to monitor air quality all the time. So I do understand that. So I believe there is the solution is finding the middle ground there, and having like a continuous monitor, but doing the periodic inspections as well. But it's not like you need to have monitors in every single room inside your building.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's like most risk. It's a process of workflows. If you find risk increases, then you increase the frequency of detailed assessment. If you find the risk is decreasing and minimal, then you may be able to back off the frequency of detailed monitoring. Risk is a
Mhm.
dynamic thing, particularly as you say, air quality. And some environments will present a higher risk or have more highly vulnerable people than others. I think what we've just not been very good at is doing those risk assessments and understanding what that building and those stakeholders that use that building need. Um, I mean, if Sotirios was the mayor of a US city and you got to write the rules, um, where do you think that middle ground is? If you were writing the rules for all public buildings, uh, for air quality monitoring, what would you mandate? What would be where do you think the sweet spot is for monitoring?
Um, that's a great question. But okay, if I was the mayor and I had to implement new rules for buildings, it's gonna be the following: having an outdoor monitor, having an indoor monitor, and trying to see the difference. deciding between the conditions outdoors and indoors and seeing if it makes sense to recirculate the air or bring more fresh air from outside. Filtration systems in place as well. And and I will definitely write some standards about what I consider good air quality and acceptable air quality and so on.
And would you mandate annual inspection with a occupational hygienist to measure the top 10 VOCs and particulate matter? And, would you say, okay, we want all public spaces to have some form of low cost monitoring? I would also like all public spaces to at least conduct a test in both seasons, maybe, of air
So I
quality.
do believe, yes, I do believe in industrial hygienists and similar professions. Sorry, I think we need experts that they make sense of the data. So I do believe that they have to go annually and do inspections and see if what they are measuring with the continuous monitoring systems are accordingly and correct. So yes.
Yeah. I'd live in your city. So that's very good. And you raise a really good point about the difference between indoor and outdoor. I think that's an often missed opportunity because it's not expensive to do. And if you're lucky, often you'll have very good
Mhm.
reference instruments quite close to you. And more we see that now, or at least a network of lower cost sensors that can be referenced against a decent sensor somewhere in your locality. So like a lot of buildings, to be fair, can get a reasonable idea. So in some parts of the world, there are other parts of the world where this isn't done, but certainly in a lot of Europe and North America, you can get a good idea of the air quality locally to your building. And if you can't, deploying one sensor for a whole building outside to get a good idea of outdoor air quality is not an expensive thing to do comparatively, and can give very useful information for making decisions. Like we said earlier, those levers that you can pull.
Mhm.
Do I recirculate? Do I need to increase the filtering? Is there certain conditions that I need to prepare for? It is a very powerful tool.
I will disagree a little bit though with what you said by relying on air quality stations, government air quality stations for the data, for the outdoor data. The reason is because I have seen many examples, even in Europe, where they will have placed the air quality station inside the forest or inside the park with many trees surrounded. Um, and then they will call that an urban air quality station. And supposedly that reflects the air quality on the streets, but it doesn't, because all of the trees are going to create like a barrier for the pollution to reach the station and measure appropriately the levels of the pollutants. So for that reason alone, I will suggest having an instrument outside your building near the ventilation system as possible, and and going from there. If you really want accurate data,
Yeah, so that's a very fair point, and the environment around an air quality sensor can make a big difference, which is a
yes.
very fair point. Yeah, and
Mhm.
damn it, I'll have to start asking people to deploy more sensors. But it's only, at least one of the things we are starting to see the deployment of these networks and meshes of low quality sensors outdoors that are making a big difference to the granularity of the data that we see, that you can at least reference
Mhm.
to things. But yeah, it's a very good point about locating them, particularly near the intake to a building, so you understand the air that's coming into the building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other day, for example, a warning was issued here for high ozone levels. So the government said stay indoors. Okay, you stay indoors, but if you want to keep track of your CO2 as well, you're going to bring air from the outside as well. So what do you do there? Are you going to bring the outdoor air inside, or are you going to keep the levels of the CO2 rising indoors? So what's the right solution there, right? Maybe this is not the right message to say to people, but in my perspective, it will be like avoid doing exercise indoors and outdoors because you never know how ozone is going to infiltrate inside the building, and avoid any activity that gonna force you to breathe deeper and inhale this ozone and deplete some of the cells inside your lungs.
Yeah. And that's the challenge of balancing risk. And it's something that
Mhm.
I think the academic arenas, particularly as they become much more closely aligned with public health and health, which they seem to be doing much more now than they were before, will start to understand where those balance of risks lie. On balance, the advice you receive as to whether to exercise outdoors or not will be based on the health benefits and mental well-being benefits of exercising versus the
Mhm.
potential long-term chronic harm of being exposed to a range of pollutants, from NOx to ozones to particulate matter and so on. It's going to be very difficult for an individual to make those kind of decisions, but as we get more advanced models and we understand those balance of probabilities, we can automate those pieces of advice much better. And particularly if you're in a controlled environment like indoors, demand controlled ventilation will start to factor a lot more than it does currently in making the right decisions for a building. Am I more at risk being exposed to 1,500, 2,000 parts per million in a meeting room right now? Because the ventilation system has shut down outdoor air because pollution outdoors is so high. Where does that risk sit?
You cannot rely only on the technology. Someone with knowledge needs always to give an input on what's going on. And every building, I know you know that for sure, like every building is different. It's like unique with different characteristics and different HVAC system. So you cannot have like a universal formula for all of them.
No, I agree. And it's one of the powerful things that Ireland did actually in the last couple of years was introduce this code of practice for indoor air quality in the workplace. What's quite powerful about it, even though it's a very simple document, is it, in theory, forces employers to think about their building from a risk perspective through the air
Mhm.
quality and ventilation. How you said earlier that you've rarely been into a conference or a hotel in North America that isn't displaying air quality in some way. Is that something you're really seeing in the States? Is that public display of air quality in at least the kind of hotels and spaces that you're going to in conferences? Because we don't necessarily see that yet in Europe, not to that
Yeah,
extent.
not so much from hotels, but from spaces that they are designed specifically for accommodation of conferences. They do have in place air quality monitors and a display at the entrance where the people that they visit, they can see the different stats for the pollutants. And you also see the logos from well buildings or reset or any other green building certificate.
Yeah, oh, that's encouraging. How long have you been over there now, in the States?
2 years,
Hmm?
actually.
How long?
two
2
years.
years. Okay, so
Yes.
post COVID predominantly.
Yes, 2022 I came here. Yeah.
Yeah. And where were you before that? Where were you working out of before? That was Spain, wasn't it?
I was in Spain, yes,
Yeah.
South Spain.
How did you find moving over there and working? 'Cause it's a big country to be.
They found me,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah. Have you enjoyed your time over there? Has it been interesting?
I mean, yeah, we are different from Americans. I think Europeans and people from the UK share a little bit more than common, ground than the American people. So yeah, at the beginning was like difficult because you have to adjust yourself in different ways that they perceive life here. Like for example, I still to this day I don't drive. I walk to my office, and for Americans, this is alarming. They cannot understand it. At first, they cannot understand it. So, a funny story here. Imagine I go to the gym here as well. So, some of my friends that I eventually made at the gym, they will see me walking to work every day. So they assumed that I was poor and I walked to to work because I didn't have money. So they didn't know where I work or nothing like that. So they came to me and they offered me a work at their business that they had, like, and to me that was very funny. Like, I'm walking because I choose to walk. My office is like 7 minutes from my home, uh, so I can walk. I don't need a vehicle to go there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I will see colleagues at my office, for example, that they live in the same household and they work in the same office, and they will come with two separate vehicles at the office.
Yeah.
Which is, for me, it's alarming. Like, it's not the right way. Like, share the vehicle if you decided to go in the same location. But don't spend gas, and don't create so much pollution just because you have the commodity here, just because gas is cheaper in the US than it is in Europe and UK, I will assume, right? So yes, there are some differences for sure.
And whereabouts are you in the States? Where are you working?
I am in Massachusetts, outside of Boston.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So a city really designed for cars as well. So it's that's the challenge, isn't it? Often is that a lot of the cities in the States are really car cities, and it's very difficult to. Whereas a lot of Mediterranean and European cities are really not car cities, so everything's set up
Yes,
very hyper
absolutely.
localized. So there's that mentality of walking to the supermarket and walking to the gym and walking to public transport is just the way it is. What's next for your blog and your kind of communication around air quality? Your output is incredible and incredibly consistent. I have to say, you've been doing this solidly now for 2 or 3 years at a really high level. Is that something you continue planning to do? Because it's a very well read blog post, I think, in the community.
Thank you. Yes, I really enjoy writing, pieces and articles on my blog. Sometimes it comes naturally to me to write something that I have observed and I want other people to learn about. And of course, I'm going to continue with that, hopefully for many years. There are some new exciting things coming this summer. I cannot reveal much now, but I'm working on a personal level on some great news for everyone out there related to air quality. Always, specifically indoor air quality, that hopefully many people will appreciate and help me as well building it.
Ooh,
That's
exciting.
as far as I can go.
Well, I'll share the link on the podcast notes so people can keep in contact with you, because that sounds intriguing.
Thank
Very
you.
cool. Yeah.
And yes, it's for me like lots of people are following my blog right now, and it's very. I'm getting such an euphoria when I see other experts in the industry following my blog. Like, you will see people from the US EPA or the EPA from Ireland or the European Environmental Agency following the blog, which means that they're gonna receive an email from me every week about a specific topic that I'm going to discuss or write about. And that gives me lots of energy and power to continue writing.
Yeah, particularly when you get such positive feedback, and it's worth checking. People do go and check out Sotirious's blog, because it's very wide ranging. Like, one week you'll be looking at a new monitor that's come out and pulling it apart and getting your screwdriver out, and other times you'll be talking about an EPA policy that's just been released and some thoughts on that. So it's very varied, and sometimes deep dives. Other times quite a light-hearted look at something. So I'll encourage people to check it out. What do you think the next 5 years of this sector looks like from what you've seen so far, and where it's going generally, because it does seem to me to be at a bit of a crossroads at the moment, and everybody I speak to has a different thought about where the traction is going to come from next. What's your thoughts?
Hmm. Um, I have more insight in the technology. So I see companies moving towards uh, new technology like measuring ultrafine particles, which is very important, especially nowadays when still the automotive industry tries to pollute the environment with different ways by breaking the particles in a smaller size range in order to pass undetectable with the conventional sensor technology that we have currently. So yes, ultrafine particle measurement is very important. I see that trending, especially in conferences for aerosols. Scientists and researchers, they really want to explore those nanoparticles, but we still don't have lots of information about the effects on human health. We know that they travel deeper and they distribute all over the body, but I haven't read many papers on the actual consequences on our health. So we will see that developing as well. Then I see that Europe is moving away from PM2.5 values as well. I think they're going to invest more efforts into the particle size distribution, which eventually is going to come in the US as well. But EPA here is a bit more of a stubborn when it comes to that space. I think they may change. Who knows? I have zero influence on them, apart from my blog. um, but yes, and then for indoor spaces, they're still trying to release some standards for indoor spaces in Europe. I think they're not ready yet. It's gonna take 1 or 2 years more, I think.
Yeah. Do you think the changes will come with the carrot or the stick, or the knowledge, the monitoring in the middle? What do you think drives change going forward? Or a mix of
I
everything?
think the good news is what we mentioned at the beginning, that the society, the academic society, has turned their attention towards that direction, and eventually they're gonna create a pressure to the political system, and eventually, the policymakers to create some legislations and frameworks around indoor air quality.
Yeah. And in the meantime, because that's quite a slow process, both
Mhm.
academically getting those strong answers, but also then politically, depending on where in the cycle it is, change happening. Um, do you think in the meantime we're building up the business case and the public health case effectively enough? Or do you think we could be pushing awareness more strongly in certain areas than we are?
It's not like one person has the definitive answer to this problem. I think it's a collaborative work and effort into getting there. Like business wise, I wouldn't suggest someone right now like building a new air quality monitor with the same technology that it's available. Um, then, if we talk about businesses that they want to create another green building certificate, that we saw like an explosion of them as well during COVID, right? I wouldn't suggest someone doing that either. Um, but I do think that like industrial hygienists are gonna have a blast of work in the future, like this kind of works that they have specific knowledge. Um, Here in the US, the things are a bit different than Europe. We have more businesses around remediation as well, especially because of the way buildings are built, like in comparison with Spain, let's say, or Greece, that the building materials are different. So they're going to influence as well um, the outcome of air quality as well. Currently, I'm also inside the steering committee with the University of Bath for alternative sustainable material for buildings. They are analyzing different materials and how good they are for indoor air quality and how fast they will degrade over time. So I'm helping with that as well. Yes, so many sectors, they are working towards that direction. Eventually, everything's going to come together, but it's not only one thing.
Yeah.
Right. So, and they all of them have to align and come in acceptance and work together.
Yeah.
In order to achieve what we are trying to educate here.
And it's hard to see the momentum from inside sometimes. I think it can seem to move very slowly when you're involved daily in it. But, I keep reminding people we only have to look back to 2018, 2019, pre-pandemic, and where we were, really, both from an awareness perspective, from a technology perspective, from a standards perspective. Things move on pretty significantly in 5-year chunks. And we are moving relatively quickly, I'd say. The built environment's a conservative old place. It tends to move quite slowly. And air quality, comparatively, I think, has moved pretty fast in the last 5 years. Assisted, of course, by a global pandemic. So we wouldn't wish that on people again. But nonetheless, I think it has moved on. And I'm firmly of the belief that certainly within the decade, and I've probably been saying this for nearly a decade, so I'm going to have to check myself at some point, but I think within the decade, most of the spaces we occupy will be monitored to some degree and will give a granularity of performance of that space, even if it's not very specific on certain pollutants. We'll have a much better idea how spaces are performing than we would have done 10 years previously. And that changes the narrative rather, I think. You start to be judged on the ongoing performance of the spaces you occupy or design or manage, rather than on whether you complied with a certain regulation when it was built. And that's an important shift in perspective. And I'll be interested to see how that translates. And for communicators like yourself, what I think is really interesting is that I think we're moving into that period of time where we're having to say, okay, what next? I think it's becoming easier to collect the data. We're now having to starting to have to do something with it. And that's a very different ask. Well, look, I wish you every success. We'll keep a very close eye on you into the summer as we figure out what you're up to, what's coming, because that's very intriguing to see. And I wish you all the best.
Hopefully you can be part of this process of what I was talking earlier. I cannot say much, but hopefully you can be part as well.
Yeah,
it's an open platform. So
right, muting mics. Right, we're back. I know all about it now. Thanks very much. Yeah, no, really excited for that. Look forward to catch up with you in a few months' time. Listen, thanks a million. I really appreciate you coming on to talk to me. It's been long overdue, mostly on me for not finding a time to sit down and chat with you. But look, thanks again for chatting, and we'll catch up again soon.
Thank you so much, Simon. And I've been listening to your podcast every morning when I walk to my office, back and forth. So I really appreciate the time you took to interview me and other fellow air quality experts, because I really believe that it helps others understand better what's going on out there right now.
Oh, brilliant. Listen, pleasure to talk to you as always. We'll chat soon. Thanks a million. Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you enjoyed the podcast and you know someone else who might be interested, do spread the word and let's keep building this community. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with 21 Degrees, ACO, Ultra Protect and Imbiot. All great companies who share the vision of the podcast and aren't here by accident. Your support of them helps their support of the podcast. Do check them out in the links and at airqualitymatters.net. See you next time.